welcome to the DME podcast, brought to you by DME, the podcast booking platform. Whether you're a podcaster or an aspiring guest, the DME app is the perfect platform for you to get booked and manage your podcast bookings. I'm your host, Sukhay, the founder of DME, and on this podcast we'll be discussing the latest news and views in tech, the ins and outs of entrepreneurship, and even dipping our toes into the adrenaline-filled world of mixed martial arts.
Today, we're thrilled to bring Professor Lincoln Allison to the DME podcast. Lincoln has a long and illustrious academic career as a political philosopher specialising in the politics and philosophy of sport. In this episode, we unpack whether sport is truly apolitical or inherently tied to power and geopolitics. We discuss the historical context of the purity of sport in the amateurism versus professionalism debate. We also address contemporary political sporting controversies with recent events such as the ban of Maccabi Tel Aviv fans from attending their upcoming fixture against Aston Villa, a team from a densely populated Muslim area of Birmingham. Lincoln also shares his insights on how sports can unify as well as divide in an ever-polarising world. And this is another fascinating and thought-provoking discussion, so please enjoy Lincoln Allison. Lincoln Allison, welcome to the DME podcast. Thank you very much for giving up your time. I appreciate you inviting me to your lovely home. Great to do these podcasts in person as opposed to remotely, as we've kind of just been speaking about off mic. Can you give our audience a short introduction to yourself and your kind of background into philosophy, politics, and sport?
Yeah, I'm a kind of academic. It doesn't exist anymore. That is to say, I had a permanent job at the age of 22 at the University of Warwick, which was pretty brand new at the time. And I was told more or less I could do what I wanted. So really a political philosopher, but I taught a course on the politics of the environment, which was a new thing. And I got into the politics of sport because I'd started writing about the history of sport, purely personal interest. And then people said, well, you know a lot about the history of sport. We have absolutely nothing going on the politics of sport. So the PSA asked me to run a panel 40 years ago. And that panel in those days, of course, consisted of a lot of talk about boycotts. We were talking about South Africa. We were talking about, actually, hunting was one of the things we covered. And, of course, the Cold War and its effects. And there have been recent boycotts by both the United States and the Soviet Union. And that was the politics of sport as it was then. And the one distinction I had, or we had, was that we were first in the game. We were the first with a book called The Politics of Sport. And compared with other academic books, and this is a small league, I hasten to add, it sold quite a lot of copies, and we moved on to sequels, an undergraduate course, a postgraduate course, and a Centre for the Study of Sport at the University of Warwick. And that lasted and my directorship was 1993 to 2002. That's a very long time ago now, but I was in a position to retire and pursue my other interests when I was 57, which is 22 years ago.
A man of great experience, we'll say. So, kind of going back to your writings, as we said, you're kind of one of the early writers on politics and sport and the philosophy of politics and sport. Is sport, in your opinion, inherently apolitical, or is it always tied to power and kind of the bigger geopolitical game?
It's both. I mean, it's inherently political, both internally and externally. As far as it has to have structures and organisations and people control it. And originally, of course, modern sport was controlled by what people refer to as amateur elite.
Yeah.
Public school, Oxford, throughout the English-speaking world, their equivalent, controlled sport, declared it to be amateur, and they wanted it to be non-political.
Yeah.
And I think people still yearn, as they did, for an idea of sport which is outside not just of politics, but of commerce as well. Something nobler and higher, something different. You look at the back page, you want to be uplifted, don't you? You look at the front page, you're downlifted. And people still yearn for that, I think, even though, of course, we're talking about a highly political, highly complicated, highly commercial activity.
Yeah. Okay, so I think we've got that. I think we can go back to kind of ancient history, and I think from my very amateur knowledge of ancient history, but even the Greeks, the big, and the Romans were also big on sport, but it was always inherently, in my opinion, tied into politics. So Roman Caesars was always put on the games whenever the society was kind of rising against them. They quickly kind of throw on some games for a month, etc., and just kind of distract the public discourse.
Yeah, many people would argue, and you're going to be a bit careful here and not simplify, but many people would argue that Greek sport is the origin of our notion of amateur elite sport. It's noble, it's connected with religion, it's done for the honor, although there were quite big prizes, in fact.
Yeah.
Whereas the Roman Colosseum is made more analogous to modern professional commercial sport. And you think of Russell Crowe, having slaughtered however many people in the arena, saying, "Are you not entertained?" So, I think people do you've got to be careful with it. People do make the distinction. The amateur elite part of our modern sport looks to Greece, and specifically look to Greece. And if I can just point out quite an interesting thing, I think you look at modern athletic events, we've got the discus and the javelin, for example. The discus and the javelin are not traditional British events, for example. The throwing event that was popular in the 19th century was the cricket ball.
Right, yeah.
But when 3 Oxford undergraduates got together and formed the Amateur Athletic Association in 1882, they were totally inspired by classical ideals, vases with discus throwers on them and javelin throwers. The javelin's incredibly dangerous, and they didn't have any javelins, but they introduced the javelin to athletics, and it's still there in the Olympics.
Well, it makes sense why those kind of originated. Obviously, the javelin and the discus throwing, etc., goes back to kind of the ancient war skills that were kind of populated and going, right, okay, so we've got who's the best discus thrower, who can throw the javelin or the spear or the furtice. So you can see that natural progression. I kind of a bit of a fan of wrestling, so you can get the wrestling sport comes from the ancient Greeks as well. So you kind of talked about the how the amateurism versus professionalism in cricket, especially. There was, in the turn of the century, there's always a big divide between the gentlemen and
Players.
There we go.
All of these sports had their own way of dealing with amateurs and professionals. The 2 major sports in this country, football and cricket, both allowed amateurs and professionals to compete on the same field. And as a Burnley fan, I can tell you that when Burnley played in the cup final in 1947, they still had an amateur on the wing. F.P. Kippax, his name was, and he was the son of a local factory owner, and he was too good to accept money for it. But we all know that in the 1880s, the professionals came to dominate football completely. Cricket is really strange and interesting in that respect, because professionals and amateurs carried on playing together till 1963. And as you probably know, in rugby union, if you'd ever taken money for writing a book about rugby or writing an article about rugby, or certainly playing rugby in the rugby league, you were totally banned from the rugby union. It was a very purist notion of amateurism. Whereas cricket said, well, they're amateurs, they're professionals, they can play together. And that lasted till 1963.
Yeah.
Although it was always said that W.G. Grace, the professional, said of him, "I wish I got paid as much as the doctor did." It was pretty shamateur, really.
Because there's lots of under the table.
Huge expenses payments.
Yeah. So it's weird that you say that. And obviously, we're talking up to the 60s with that distinction between professionals and amateurs. I'm a little bit of a fan of American sports as well, and American football. And obviously, the NFL is massively commercialized and professional. But it's only just, in the last 2 years, I think, the college game, which draws audiences of 100,000 people in some of the big colleges, etc. And they had a steadfast rule that if as a college player, you'd be playing for 3 years, for example, you could not make a penny, and you could be thrown out of the league for earning anything.
As you know, because you've done your research, I've written a book on amateurism, and I include as an appendix all 17 pages of the then NCAA definition of amateurism, which is based on the spirit that sport is an avocation, not a vocation. It should be a secondary thing in your life, always, however wonderful it is, however much of an enhancement of your life. It's not the main thing, and it's certainly not your breadwinner. And they've liberalised the laws recently, because people used to point out, look, these guys, supposing you've got a guy who's on a scholarship, 10,000 a year, he gets his fees paid, that's all good, and he plays for 4 years and then he gets injured in the 4th year. This is a top-class American footballer who ends up on the dole, basically, or ends up, unemployed.
Which I could see from if you're trying to maintain the purity of the sport, which to kind of justify, But then you see the colleges themselves going, they're selling their TV rights and they're selling all sorts of the branded merchandise, etc., with the players' names. And you're like, hang on a second, this doesn't quite equate here. You're generating all this revenue, but not giving it out to the guys who are actually giving you that revenue in. But so does that amateurism versus profession kind of interfere with the purity of the sport? Is that an old idea now? We've gone far beyond that.
I have to say, I don't think we've got far beyond that, but I don't think it is. If you're looking for a spirit of sportsmanship in sport, then you don't always find it in amateurism, and you do sometimes find it in professionalism.
Yeah.
So the idea that amateurs are good sportsmen and professionals aren't. In the history of cricket, of course, we have the most unscrupulous captain probably ever was Douglas Jardine, who captained England against Australia in the so-called Bodyline series, and attempted essentially to frighten and maim Australian batsmen with his tactics. Pure amateur, of course, and quite aristocratic, and so on.
So actually, that's kind of interesting, right? So if you're not incentivized by what we kind of the money and the fame that would come with it today, we're going back to when the Bodyline series went 1930?
33.
33, there we go. Sorry. The knowledge of history is a bit better than mine. What is a motivation for those guys? It's got to be purely professional, right? Either pride in one's country or pride in one's team to actually be winning. Is it the social rewards that is the incentive for someone like Jardine? And
simple answer to that, I asked a number of people who were top sportsmen for my book on amateurism. I wanted to talk to people who'd competed as an amateur and as a professional, not just as an amateur when they were very young, like golfers call themselves amateurs up to the age of 18 and so on. I mean, people who competed as a full adult, as an amateur, and then the sport went professional, and they competed as a professional. So I'm drawing on athletes and rugby players from the 1970s and the 1980s particularly, and every single one of them, when asked the question, was money a motivation when you were actually competing? The answer was never, ever, never crossed my mind. Now, I don't know whether you'd find that of all professional footballers, but I remember Robbie Brightwell, who competed in the Olympic final, was the father of 3 professional footballers and the husband of Anne Packer, who won a gold medal at the 1964 Olympics. So he knew a lot about sport. He said, no. He said, the thing that drives you all the time is to avoid humiliation, to avoid underselling yourself. That's what is always with you when you're on a top-class sports field. And I believe that. That's roughly what other people said. David Moorcroft told me that he competed, and he competed because he wanted to do is to get the best out of himself. That's quite a common expression.
Yeah.
He said, and then on one occasion in Zurich, he was competing in a meeting and they gave him a check. And he said, he'd never been given one before.
Right.
And he put it under his pillow and he could not sleep all night for the thought that his career had somehow been contaminated now by the fact that he'd been paid to run.
Right, okay, that's quite fascinating. That does harken back to kind of a time where it does feel that sports was a lot more pure. I remember as a kid, you're watching the Olympics, etc. Like, well, these guys have got day jobs, and even if you watch the third round of the FA Cup, and you've got the non-league side who are all bricklayers and carpenters, etc. And they've got the great giant killing story. You'd always get one of those every year. It seems far removed now. You rarely get that, and even these semi-professionals that play today, and I think there's a very popular series, I think, on YouTube about is it Dorking Wanderers? I'm not sure if you've seen it or not, but
I haven't, no.
So it's a fly on the wall about an amateur club started 10 years ago, and it's guys who are just got regular jobs really, and kind of labourers and merchants, whatever they may be, but they all get together and play they follow the story of the football club as they kind of started from inception, working their way through kind of the lower tiers of those. So I think there's still from the fans' perspective, I think they still yearn for. There is a big demand for the purity of the sport, but I think as you go up through the professional leagues, and as the incentives are so great these days, it's life changing. I see it a lot in kind of the youth football level, like door to plays, etc. And kind of watching kids and their parents, they see their child as a ticket to a better life, and they push them so hard. And as they get so, some parents will get tutors for the children to get them into a better school. Some parents will just send their kids to 3-4 different coaches every week just to improve their sporting ability, whether it's football, whether it's cricket, whether it's golf, etc., etc. So I'm thinking, as time has shifted, maybe over the last 20 years, I don't know what the time frame would be, but I don't see that amateur purity of the sport too much these days. I don't know whether it exists in other sports like athletics or whether that's still the case. But
Well, you've got to remember that 99% of sportsmen are amateurs.
yeah,
And if I was trying to convince you of the continuing importance of amateurism, I'll take you down the tennis club about a quarter mile away, where I go, and you can. I mean, two scenes here. One is you can go. It's a winter afternoon. There's hardly anybody left on court, and you hear this father saying to his daughter, "Come on, Elaine, another half hour. The people don't get to the top by going home early and so on." And you can go. It was rather an amusing scene when a German lad actually, I think working for JLR, who I played at singles, and he turned up on a weekday. There were 12 courts, and they were all full, and 4 of those were kids, and 8 of them were pensioners, basically playing tennis. And the amount of laughter going on, and the women dropping your racket and clapping because the shot had been brilliant and so on. The sheer pleasure that was going on, compared with the poor girl who I knew wasn't going to make it as a professional tennis player, but her father thinks she is. I mean, that's where I'd say, look, it's probably far healthier for almost everybody to look upon their sporting life as an amateur thing and not try to get to the top or make money out of it, but enjoy your sport and your comradeship and so on. So I would still say there are some very miserable things said by professional footballers, aren't there? I mean, sure. Steve Archibald saying, team spirit, that's something that exists for 10 minutes after you've won a major trophy, and so on, which you're dependent for your very obvious public performance, for your living and your reputation and everything. You can't play cricket on Sunday and have a nightmare and then go to work on Monday and forget about it.
Yeah.
I think professional sports is a source of great misery.
Yeah, I mean, it's even the team sports seems to be so geared to all the individual these days. So it's always focusing on the individual, unlike whether it's a cricket team or a football team or rugby team, whatever it may be. Even basketball, for example. I'm a big fan of basketball, but it all seems to be geared towards the individual and following the individual. Hang on a second.
Yeah,
it's a team game. You win and you play together and you lose together. So, although I think Liverpool fans, so a lot of contentious talk of the last couple of weeks has been whether Mo Salah should be in the team because obviously not performing very well. But hang on a second, won the league last year, and there's a massive argument going on. It happens in all sports, whether it be Ronaldo or Messi in the football side of things. It was always centered around those players. But hang on a second, there's only, from my perspective, the only thing that maintains in the football world and any kind of team sports is it's the team and the badge, and the fans are the ones who maintain. Owners come and go, players come and go, stadiums come and go, to be honest.
all of that.
So it's the only thing that maintains it. So, yes, you remember the great players and they get venerated throughout as time passes. But everybody, the time comes for every player. So you kind of have to...
Yeah, no, I follow that debate. I mean, funnily enough, last night I was with a friend. We were at the theatre and we were walking back, and he's a Sheffield United supporter. And I'd introduced him to the dreaded HYS, the comments section of the BBC match reports. And there's a particular player for Sheffield United, I won't bother to name, who was constantly and unanimously being derogated. And you think, well, does the bloke read it? I mean, what does it feel like when you're playing in front of 20,000 people and that's what they're thinking about?
Yeah.
And, I mean, it's not a particularly pleasant prospect, is it?
No, I can imagine not. But I think that's kind of the modern world with social media. Whereas in, say, 15 years ago, you would never come in contact with a professional player. But anyway, the only way you'd kind of hear what they had to say was via an interview in the newspaper or by the TV, would given an interview. It's all very controlled. You might hear from them after the match for a few comments, but that was it. But then you've got fans who had direct contact with that player, whether it's on Instagram, Twitter, whatever it may be.
Yeah.
So for a player, I think they're all quite aware of it, because you'll see after the game, sometimes they'll come out, various players will come out and make a statement, oh, sorry, that was a bad performance, or blah, blah, blah. But they quickly, the amount of times you see a player kind of delete comments or kind of close their social media down or whatever it may be, because they obviously are reading it. So it's got to affect your performance to an extent, hasn't it?
Yes, I think it has. I must say, when I've occasionally written articles, particularly on higher education, that have aroused a Twitter storm, and I don't read it.
Right.
I mean, the editor tells me, you want to have a look at, this. You've excited people in both directions. I'm not going to look at that.
No. So, talking about exciting people with the opinions, one of the most topical conversations around sports and politics at the moment is Maccabi Tel Aviv and their upcoming trip to Villa Park and the banning of their fans. And obviously that's in the wider context of the Israel-Palestine-Gaza conflict that's going on. What are the kind of facts around the banning of kind of away fans, particularly Maccabi Tel Aviv fans from Villa Park, that you're aware of?
Well, I can look at this as a political philosopher or as a sports fan, if you like. I think Lisa Nandy said that this was unprecedented. It is absolutely not unprecedented. Bans on away fans and bans on fans are extremely common in football. And to take the extreme example, imagine you were an Everton fan who in 1985 won the league and qualified for, I can't remember what it was called, the European Cup or the Champions League at that point. I think it was probably called the European Cup.
Yeah.
And then because of Liverpool fans' behaviour, you are subject to a 5-year ban on all of English football playing in Europe. Now, blanket bans like that are, in international law, completely prohibited in other fields. I mean, sports kind of self-governing, it's its own will.
Yeah.
But any kind of punishment of the innocent along with the guilty, collective punishment, partly because of the experience of Nazism and the collective punishments that the Nazi regime imposed, that is completely taboo in international law. But a sporting organisation, sport's very autonomous, can do it. Now that's banning everybody from playing, from going away, a really severe and hurtful ban, which lasted for 5 years. Other bans, not being able to go to one game seems extremely small by comparison. And the context, of course, in sporting terms is they're probably not the most violent and nationalistic team in Israel, but they are the second.
Right.
And they are pretty violent and nationalistic, and they have caused a great deal of trouble. And when they came across Palestinian protesters in the past, they've ripped up flags, beaten people up. You can dress this up, I can see, as an issue of anti-Semitism, because you can say, well, you're banning the Jewish fans because you're afraid of the Islamic protesters and you're being intimidated by the Islamic protesters. But Celtic have banned Rangers fans in the immediate past. Rangers have banned Celtic fans. English people, and I think Lisa Nandy might fall into this category in what she says, are pretty naive about this because we don't have football teams that have political meanings and affiliations.
Okay.
The Scots do, the Northern Irish do, but the English and the Welsh don't. The Israelis very much do. Next door to them, the Jordanians do. Some Jordanian teams supported by Palestinian refugees and some by indigenous Jordanians, and there's a lot of hostility between them, and so on. In Germany, there are big cities have left-wing and right-wing teams, Hamburg and Munich, and so on. We're not used to that. We're getting a little element of that if you look around, as you almost certainly have, at people's reaction to Liverpool fans booing the national anthem.
Yep.
Liverpool are sort of purporting to stand for something political in a way that English football clubs generally do not.
Yeah.
And I think the understanding that trying to keep that football politics, where the football club has an affiliation to a political movement, apart. And in this case, we're talking about possibly two different global views of the world.
Yeah.
Though those people in this, I think people in this country are very foolish if they support either Israel or Hamas. But those people who do support Israel do so on the grounds that they're basically on our side, alongside Western Europe, the United States, and against Russia, Iran, China, etc. And those people who support Palestine are doing so basically on the grounds, let's call them Corbynite grounds, that we are anti-colonial and Israel is a form of colonialism.
Yeah.
And you put that together in a football match at a big crowd, and you say, John Stuart Mill, the great theorist of liberalism, who gave us many of our thoughts about liberty, actually was very much in favour of freedom of private life, freedom of expression, freedom of worship, but was not very keen on freedom of assembly.
Okay.
So, I mean, one of his famous arguments is it is all very well to say that the Corn Laws should be abolished, but to do so in front of a drunken mob with a corn merchant's house behind you would be foolish and must not be allowed. So the freedom of assembly is something that people invoke, I think, particularly on the left. But classic liberal theory is not very keen on freedom of assembly. Right. The words drunken mob come into it, and I think we're dealing with that. This is not taking away people's freedom to associate with each other or express themselves or worship. This is taking away their freedom to go to a particular football match.
Yeah.
And there are lots of precedents and lots of good liberal arguments that say that's okay.
Yeah, so it's kind of the phrase that kind of cropped into my mind was the madness of crowds, right?
Yeah.
You can have that, and but then going back to the kind of liberty arguments, if you, from a Aston Villa's perspective, because they've got the rights of private property, right? They don't have to accept any kind of fans that they don't want to. From a Westminster police perspective, they can say, well, we can't guarantee that we need to control our borders of our town, of our city, etc. So you got those kind of nationalistic, protectionist arguments there. To kind of counter the point, though, I think the local MPs, who I think Ayub Khan, I think is a local MP.
Stop me, I do not know that.
It's only because I saw him post a video about 3-4 weeks ago, well before I even knew there's a Maccabi Tel Aviv Aston Villa match being planned, and his argument wasn't about safety then. His argument was about the moral grounds. How can we accept this team who are Israeli and was a genocide going on in Palestine? It wasn't about safety. It's only those arguments I think I've been post hoc in terms of, oh well, they're quite violent, those fans. Yeah, so a lot of fans, a lot of teams have fans. The hypocrisy is what kind of stood out to me, right?
Yes, well, he's taking sides in this that particular view of geopolitics, and I think, honestly, that's unacceptable in an MP. That to do it, that's the trouble. Whether or not you do it is one question. On the grounds on which you do it is a different thing altogether. So my grounds for allowing that ban would be completely different from his, as you're probably very clear.
I think you've got to have consistency, right? If you're going to ban certain fan groups because they've got a history or whatever, fine, right? It's the same rules for everybody. Apply it universally. Fine, everyone knows where they stand, right? Actually, we're not going to get that. We've got a stadium ban, we've got a travel ban, or whatever it may be. But it's the kind of where it's subjective and where it's pick a mix and we'll choose who to ban and when. That's when the politics side comes in, and I think that's where I kind of don't like it very much. And I kind of go, right, actually,
sure. And that's. I mean, the most recent book I did with a co-author was on international sporting organisations. Mm-hmm. Particularly, of course, the mega ones, which is FIFA and the IOC.
Yeah.
And they face that problem all the time. I mean, there's always been calls to ban so-and-so. Now, you've got to normally argue that it's not just some general moral precept that they're offending against. It's a sporting precept. So yes. Apartheid was a particular case. But these organisations are understandably always terrified of expelling anybody because they think it's the thin end of the wedge.
Yeah.
Well, if you throw out the Ruritanians, what about the Urbanians? They're pretty badly behaved as well, and so on. And so South Africa did become a test case.
Yeah.
The Soviet Union was obviously always normally accepted, apart from the invasion of Afghanistan, which did, of course, lead to a boycott of the Moscow Olympics in 1980. But you can understand this inclusiveness that I mean, the EU's got it as well.
Yeah.
I mean, why don't they kick out Hungary? Life would be a lot easier without Hungary at the moment, but they're absolutely not going to do that.
No. Yeah, it's for the president. It says, I mean, one of the most galling ones to me is after the Russian-Ukrainian invasion. It was, you're banning the Russian players from Wimbledon? I was like, oh, how does that make sense?
No. Yeah, I was just saying that they, of course, simply appear, but with a little grey rectangle instead of a flag.
Yeah, well, going back to the liberty arguments, you've got the British government forcing Russian oligarchs, however corrupt or criminal they may or may not be, but you were stripping them of their private property and selling them. So Chelsea Football Club is like, right, you can't own that anymore. It sets a massively dangerous precedent.
It is.
So today's bogeyman's Russia, and 90% of the liberal elites out there kind of clapped and nodded along and supported it. But hang on a second. If you've set the precedent there, in the next couple of years, when somebody else you don't like comes along, and that wedge gets ever so...
He starts to... Yeah, but I only agree with that. That is a potentially dangerous precedent. It's one that, on the whole, in the past, people have tried to avoid. But, things are getting more polarised in several dimensions at the moment.
And you can see, I think it's going to, over the next 12 months, you can see kind of coming further, growing influence of politics as well. Because I think just on President Trump did the Gaza and Palestinian peace talk the other week, and right beside him is sitting Gianni Infantino of FIFA. And the World Cup is in America and North America next year in 2026. So I think the politics and sport is meshing very, very closely there. You can see them siding up to each other. So how do you see the future trends of sport and politics? Are we going to go back to a bit more of a demarcated line between just the purity of the sport, or is it inherently linked now and it's going to be...
Well, I think there's two different issues. One is they're talking about the purity of the sport and sportsmanship, bringing up issues of drugs and so on. And the other is the extent to which politics, full macro politics, is going to interfere and impinge on sport. And of course, we went in the right direction in the 1990s because apartheid disappeared. The Cold War ended, and then there were no boycotts and no reason to boycott. And now we're moving in directions of a much more polarized, a kind of new Cold War, and a kind of delineated, and we know who's on which side potentially, and to a lot of people will want to use sport for that. Well, of course, we already have in the case of Russia. Russian teams do not compete in any international events, although Russian individuals are allowed to, which is principally tennis, I think, and athletics a bit.
Yeah. I mean, the other use case that just kind of coming to mind is the IPL in cricket. I think maybe we can, rather than using sport to divide, we could probably use sport as in a unifier and go back to the 90s a little bit, where at the moment you've got no Pakistan players are playing in the IPL, which just seems ludicrous to me. It's a free market.
And the other issue in cricket, of course, is Afghanistan.
Exactly, yeah.
Because if we're talking about unacceptable regimes, Afghanistan is a potential number one. But we want to encourage
participation.
We want to encourage the participation of Afghans in cricket, and we're very pleased that Afghans become a fairly serious cricket playing nation. Cricket fans are, anyway.
Exactly. When you look at the argument for it and you say, hang on a second, fine, the Taliban regime are what they are, but if you look at Afghanistan 15 years ago in terms of the level of Afghanistan cricket, but now you've got some seriously top 10 world players. I'll call it the leg spinner's name.
I'm big as well.
But you've got some genuinely high quality players coming out of that country, and you're like, well, do you deny them that opportunity? Is it their fault? Can they control who their government are? But I think that's a fascinating conversation. We could kind of go on forever, but I won't keep you too long. If any of our audience wanted to kind of find out more about your kind of previous writing, I'm not sure if you're still actively writing new papers or articles, but where can they kind of find out a little bit more about?
Well, I've just sort of stopped, and I'm in favour of doing something more cheerful, which is writing a book, 1/3 of which will be about the best sporting events I've ever witnessed.
Okay,
but the key with me, it's very, very simple. My name is unique. So if you put Lincoln Allison on Google, you only get me. There's a long story behind why I'm called Lincoln, but I'll spare you that. But my eldest son, for example, is called James, and there are hundreds of James Allisons, some of whom are pretty distinguished. So that would be a lot more difficult. But all you've got to put is Lincoln, spelled like the city or the president, and then Allison with 2 L's, and you find a lot of stuff by me.
Lincoln Allison, thank you very much for your time and appearing on the DME podcast.